Greenwood Park, a place of laughter, warmth, and innocence, became the scene of a shocking act of cruelty that no one present could have anticipated. Mark Sullivan, a uniformed police officer on duty, stood over an 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair, his face twisted with a fury that seemed entirely out of place. His clenched fist hovered in the air, radiating an anger so intense it felt dangerous. This was Lily Harper, a child full of life despite her frail body, now caught in the gaze of someone who should have been her protector, but had instead become her threat. "Get out of the way, you little brat!" Sullivan barked, his voice slicing through the joyful noise of the park. The hostility in his words sent a chill through the crowd nearby, and the laughter that had filled the air moments ago faded, replaced by gasps and murmurs. Lily, though her small hands gripped the sides of her wheelchair tightly, looked back at him, her face pale but defiant, refusing to let his intimidation break her spirit. But she was just a child facing the wrath of a fully grown man in uniform, and everyone around could see the unfairness and the danger unfolding before their eyes. What happened next shocked everyone to their core. In a flash, Sullivan's hand whipped through the air and struck Lily across the face, the sound of the slap as sharp and brutal as a gunshot. The crowd fell silent, frozen in collective disbelief. Parents pulled their children close, shielding them from the ugliness of what they'd just witnessed, while others reached for their phones, capturing the awful moment. It was as if time had stopped, all eyes fixed on the helpless girl and the man who had crossed every line. But just then, a figure surged through the crowd with purpose and fury. It was Ethan Harper, Lily's father, a man whose own face was now twisted in a mix of terror, anger, and sheer resolve. But Sullivan had no idea whom he had just dared to lay a hand on. This wasn't just any father. Ethan Harper was an FBI agent, a man trained to face danger and a fierce protector of his daughter. What followed would be an unforgettable clash between cruelty and justice. How could this act of brutality be allowed? What would a father do to protect his child? Follow this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. The air in Greenwood Park had been filled with the vibrant sounds of a summer afternoon, the laughter of children, the upbeat rhythms from a nearby festival, and the cheerful hum of families enjoying time together. Under the warm sunlight, the park seemed like a world of innocence, a sanctuary where nothing dark could reach. But how quickly that peace was shattered. Near the swings, Lily Harper had been happily taking in the sights, her wheelchair decorated with bright stickers that reflected her love for adventure and her courageous spirit. The spark of joy in her eyes was unmistakable. Her father, Ethan, had promised her a day at the festival, a break from the medical appointments and the challenges she faced daily. For Lily, every outing was a gift, a chance to explore, to dream, and to feel like every other child. Nearby, Ethan Harper had watched his daughter with pride. This was a rare moment of calm for him, a break from his high-stakes career as an FBI agent. He knew more than anyone the dangers lurking in the world, but seeing Lily's strength and resilience always rekindled his hope. She was the light in his life, a reminder that innocence and courage could exist even in a world filled with shadows. But today, Ethan's peaceful moment was shattered. A heavy unease filled the air, like a dark cloud overshadowing the park's brightness. Ethan's trained instincts picked up on the shift immediately, his eyes darting to where a crowd was beginning to gather. And then, amidst the whispers and the shocked faces, he saw her, the bright blue wheelchair unmistakable in the distance. But this time, Lily's small figure was hunched, her face a mix of shock and fear. His heart skipped a beat, a sense of dread flooding over him as he realized that something terrible had happened to his little girl. In that instant, the joyful sounds of the park vanished, replaced by a tense silence as parents and children alike turned to watch the scene unfolding near the playground. Faces showed disbelief, anger, and horror. Some parents instinctively shielded their children, as if to protect them from a reality too harsh to comprehend. Others pulled out their phones, documenting every second of this shocking encounter. But for Ethan, the world around him disappeared. The carefree afternoon was now a cruel twist of fate, turning his sanctuary into a battleground where his daughter had become the victim of an unimaginable act. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew one thing: whatever had happened to Lily, he would stop at nothing to set things right. Ethan's pulse quickened as he pushed through the crowd, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding just ahead. What he saw made his blood run cold. Officer Mark Sullivan, towering over little Lily, stood in her path like an immovable wall. The look in Sullivan's eyes was anything but professional. His face was a mask of disdain, his jaw clenched, his brows furrowed in anger, a look that had no place on the face of someone entrusted with the duty of protection. "Didn't you hear me?" Sullivan barked, his voice sharp and filled with contempt. He leaned forward, his imposing figure casting a dark shadow over the small girl. "I told you to get out of here. You don't belong with the other kids." Lily's heart raced, but she didn't back down. Her father had always taught her to stand tall, to never let anyone make her feel small or unwelcome because of her wheelchair. She gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles turning white, her eyes lifting to meet Sullivan's. I just wanted to play," she said, her voice wavering but determined. But her words only seemed to fuel Sullivan's irritation. His lips twisted into a sneer, a look of pure hostility that sent a wave of unease through the onlookers. Why was a grown man, a police officer, showing such cruelty toward a child, and a disabled one at that? His stance was aggressive, his voice laced with venom, and for a moment, it was as if the world around them faded, leaving only the tension between the officer and the defenseless little girl. Lily tried to back her wheelchair up, but the gravel path made it difficult. The wheels skidded slightly, and she could feel the panic rising within her. She was trapped, unable to move forward or escape. Yet even in her fear, she held her ground, her eyes not leaving his. There was a bravery in her gaze, a quiet defiance that said she would not be broken, no matter what he threw at her. Just then, Sullivan's hand shot out, blocking her movement. His voice dropped to a menacing growl, barely above a whisper but filled with a chilling authority. "Kids like you don't belong here. Why don't you get that?" he hissed, as if her very presence in the park was an offense to him. The crowd shifted, discomfort growing in the faces of parents and children alike. The carefree park had transformed into a stage for an act of bullying, an officer abusing his power to belittle a child who only wanted to play. Across the park, Ethan watched in horror as the full reality of the scene struck him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was blatant, heartless intimidation. And his daughter was at the center of it. Every muscle in his body tensed, his fists clenching in rage as he forced his way through the bystanders. He could barely hear the concerned murmurs of those around him, every fiber of his being focused on reaching Lily and putting an end to this nightmare. For Sullivan, it was as if Lily's resistance ignited something even darker. He stepped forward once more, his voice rising in anger, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You're in my way, little girl! Get out or I'll make you!" It was a moment that seemed to hang in the air, frozen in time. The innocence of the day had turned into a nightmare, the laughter of the park now a distant memory replaced by the sound of Sullivan's harsh words. This was no longer a simple conflict, it was a display of abuse, a man with power looming over a child with none. Just then, as the crowd watched in stunned silence, Lily's father broke through, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear, anger, and unbreakable resolve. Ethan Harper was not just a father now, he was a force determined to defend his daughter. And Mark Sullivan had no idea what he was about to face. As Ethan closed in, he saw something that made his heart stop. In one swift, unprovoked movement, Sullivan's hand shot out, striking Lily across the face. The impact sent a shockwave through the crowd. The slap was sharp, brutal, like a thunderclap cutting through the silence. Lily gasped, her small hand flying to her cheek as her eyes widened in shock and pain. For a brief, agonizing moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The crowd, the laughter, the sunshine, all of it vanished in the brutal reality of what had just happened. Parents pulled their children close, shielding them from the scene, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some onlookers scrambled to take out their phones, documenting the shocking act of violence, their hands shaking as they recorded. It was as if no one could fully process what they had just witnessed. An officer, someone meant to protect, striking a child, and a disabled one at that. Ethan's vision blurred with fury as he reached his daughter's side, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow as he knelt beside her. Lily looked up at him, her cheek red and swollen, tears welling in her eyes, but her gaze still filled with the same quiet resilience. It was a sight that tore at his heart, a pain he could never have imagined. Here was his brave little girl, enduring the unthinkable at the hands of a man who wore a badge. But Ethan's anger was now afire, fierce and unyielding. He rose, positioning himself between Lily and Sullivan, his posture protective, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His voice, usually calm and controlled, broke through in a tone as cold as steel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his words echoing with the weight of a father's fury and an agent's authority. For the first time, Sullivan hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the intensity in Ethan's gaze. The officer tried to maintain his bravado, but there was an uncertainty creeping into his stance, a flicker of fear in his eyes as he realized he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Yet he attempted to brush off the confrontation, scoffing at Ethan, trying to downplay what he had just done. But the crowd wasn't on his side. Murmurs turned into whispers, whispers into shouts, as outrage grew among the onlookers. Ethan glanced back at Lily, her trembling body tucked safely behind him, and felt a renewed surge of determination. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about confronting an abuse of power that no one in that park could ignore. Ethan's entire body was tense as he faced Mark Sullivan. His gaze was fierce, unyielding, a stark contrast to Sullivan's faltering confidence. In that moment, Ethan wasn't just a father protecting his child. He was an agent of justice confronting an abuse of power, and everyone around could feel it. His words, steady but laced with fury, cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "How dare you touch her?" Ethan demanded, his voice low but carrying an authority that seemed to pin Sullivan in place. The crowd leaned in, every eye focused on the confrontation, the energy around them crackling with tension. Sullivan's initial shock gave way to defiance. He squared his shoulders, straightening up as he looked back at Ethan, attempting to regain control. "Back off!" Sullivan snarled, his tone a mixture of frustration and forced bravado. "This is none of your business." But Ethan stepped forward, unflinching, positioning himself between Sullivan and Lily, whose small form was safely shielded behind him. The fear that had once filled her eyes was replaced by a flicker of hope as she looked up at her father, trusting that he would protect her. Ethan's stance was unbreakable, his voice resolute. "You made it my business the second you laid a hand on her." Sullivan's eyes darted nervously to the crowd, which had grown larger, their faces set in expressions of outrage and disgust. Parents whispered to each other, their voices growing louder, condemning Sullivan's actions. Some shouted, "Justice for Lily!" while others demanded accountability. The officer could feel the weight of their anger pressing down on him, and for the first time, his badge felt less like a shield and more like a burden. Ethan took another step forward, his voice now a cold, deliberate threat. "You think you can intimidate a child, just because you wear a uniform?" His words were spoken with a deadly calm, his rage carefully controlled but unmistakable. "You think that badge gives you the right to bully those who can't defend themselves?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Sullivan's face. He had expected his authority to be enough, had thought that the crowd would side with him, or at least remain silent. But the people around him were not indifferent. They were witnesses, and their loyalty was now firmly on the side of justice. The crowd's anger had turned into a low roar, a chorus of voices demanding Sullivan face the consequences of his actions. Sullivan tried one last attempt to assert his control, pointing his finger at Ethan, his voice loud and defensive. "You're going to regret this. I'm a police officer, and I don't need to answer to you or anyone here." But Ethan's expression remained unshaken, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's. He leaned in, his voice a fierce whisper that only the officer could hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't just about my daughter, it's about every person you've mistreated, every abuse of power you've hidden behind that badge." The finality of his words hung in the air, and Sullivan's bravado cracked, his confidence now visibly shaken. He could feel the condemnation radiating from the crowd, their chants of "Justice for Lily!" growing louder, as if the weight of their collective outrage was physically bearing down on him. Every phone in the crowd was pointed in his direction, capturing his every twitch, every flicker of fear. Realizing he had lost the control he so desperately clung to, Sullivan took a step back, trying to distance himself from Ethan's unyielding presence. But the retreat only cemented his guilt in the eyes of the crowd. They had seen enough. They knew what they'd witnessed was wrong, and they weren't going to let him walk away without consequence. Ethan, sensing Sullivan's fear, felt a surge of determination rise within him. This wasn't the end. He would ensure Sullivan faced justice, not just for Lily, but for every family who had suffered at the hands of those meant to protect them. Just as Sullivan's confidence began to crack, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, piercing through the tense silence. Moments later, 2 squad cars pulled up to the edge of the park, and several officers stepped out, assessing the scene before them. They moved quickly toward Sullivan, noting the hostile crowd and the phone cameras pointed squarely in his direction. Their eyes shifted nervously between Sullivan, Ethan, and the murmuring crowd. One of the officers, a sergeant with a cautious expression, stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "What's going on here?" he demanded, trying to command control of the situation. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in his eyes, a realization that he'd walked into a volatile situation where the crowd's loyalty clearly did not lie with his colleague. Ethan stood tall, his frame unyielding as he met the sergeant's gaze. The anger in his eyes was palpable, but his voice was measured, calm with a chilling edge. "This man," Ethan said, gesturing toward Sullivan, physically assaulted my daughter, an 8-year-old girl, without any reason or provocation. His words hung in the air, every syllable carrying the weight of what had just occurred. Gasps and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, strengthening the gravity of the accusation. Sullivan, now flanked by his fellow officers, made an attempt to downplay the situation, his tone dismissive. She was in the way, causing trouble, he muttered, though his voice faltered as the crowd erupted in furious whispers. His feeble excuse did little to sway the onlookers. Instead, it only seemed to solidify their outrage. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching once more as he turned back to the sergeant. "Trouble? She's a child, sitting in a wheelchair, trying to enjoy a day at the park," he said, his voice filled with a father's protective anger. And he thought his uniform gave him the right to intimidate her? The crowd, emboldened by Ethan's words, began to chant, "Justice for Lily." Louder and louder, the sound growing into a wave of support that echoed through the park. The sergeant's composure wavered as he looked from the fierce determination on Ethan's face to the phones recording every second of the encounter. He understood all too well that this was a situation with serious implications, not only for Sullivan but for the entire police force. The pressure from the crowd, the undeniable evidence on the cameras, and the fury in Ethan's eyes made one thing clear: this wasn't going to disappear quietly. Ethan took a step closer, his presence commanding, his voice low but unshakably firm. "You think I'll let this go? My daughter deserves justice, and I won't stop until she gets it," he said, his words carrying a powerful warning. This isn't just about one slap or one officer. It's about accountability, about ensuring this never happens again. His gaze bore into the sergeant, making it clear that Ethan would not back down, no matter what it took. For the first time, the sergeant seemed to grasp the depth of Ethan's resolve. This was a man who wouldn't be silenced or intimidated. He signaled to his fellow officers, and with a reluctant nod they moved to place Sullivan in handcuffs, if only to calm the crowd and demonstrate some semblance of accountability. The sight of Sullivan being restrained sparked a cheer from the onlookers, their voices swelling with a renewed sense of justice. Sullivan cast one last defiant glare at Ethan and Lily, but there was an unmistakable hint of fear in his eyes, a realization that he had lost his grip on the power he had so easily abused. As he was led away, his head lowered, the crowd continued to chant, their voices filled with hope and anger, echoing Ethan's unwavering promise. Justice for Lily. Ethan knelt beside Lily, his expression softening as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her face still marked by the assault but her spirit unbroken. Ethan's heart swelled with pride and sorrow, knowing that what they'd been through would leave a lasting scar, but also knowing that he would do everything in his power to ensure her suffering wasn't in vain. In the days that followed the shocking incident at Greenwood Park, the video of Officer Sullivan's brutal assault on Lily Harper spread like wildfire across social media. The footage, filled with the undeniable sounds and sights of injustice, struck a nerve with people everywhere. Thousands shared the video, and the hashtags #JusticeForLily and #StandWithLily became rallying cries, sparking conversations across the nation about the abuse of power and the need for accountability in law enforcement. It was no longer just a local issue, it had become a symbol of something far larger. News outlets quickly picked up the story, airing clips of the incident alongside interviews with witnesses who had been present in the park that day. It was horrifying. One mother recounted, her voice shaking with emotion. "I watched as an officer, someone we trust to protect our children, struck a little girl. I'll never forget the look on her face." The impact of Lily's story was undeniable, reaching people from all walks of life who felt compelled to speak out against the injustice she had endured. Ethan Harper, who had always preferred to keep a low profile despite his high-stakes career as an FBI agent, found himself at the center of a whirlwind of media attention. Messages poured in from every corner of the country, strangers offering their support, fellow parents sharing their outrage, and activists calling for reform. As he scrolled through countless messages, Ethan felt a surge of gratitude but also a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was a moment to stand up for all the children who deserve better, for every family who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. The local community rallied around the Harpers in a way Ethan hadn't anticipated. The neighborhood, once a quiet, close-knit place, turned into a hub of activism. Signs reading, "Justice for Lily," appeared in the windows of homes and businesses, and local churches, schools, and organizations reached out to offer their support. Community members organized peaceful marches through the streets, holding candles and signs, their voices united in a call for accountability and change. In their eyes, Lily wasn't just a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, and her fight had become their fight. One evening, as Ethan and Lily returned from a doctor's appointment, they were greeted by a group of neighbors gathered in front of their home, holding candles in a silent show of solidarity. The sight took Ethan by surprise, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at the faces of people who had come to stand with them, to let them know they were not alone. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she looked at the crowd, a small, grateful smile appearing on her face for the first time since the incident. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, barely able to find the words to express his gratitude. It was a moment that reminded him of the power of community, of how people could come together to lift each other up in the darkest of times. But the support wasn't limited to their town. Advocacy groups for police reform and civil rights reached out, inviting Ethan to speak at rallies and share Lily's story as a way to amplify the demand for systemic change. Although Ethan was a private man, more comfortable handling cases behind closed doors, he knew this was a battle worth fighting publicly. With Lily's permission, he agreed to speak, not just for her but for every child and every family who might face the same pain. At the first rally, held in the heart of the city, hundreds gathered, holding signs that read, "Protect our children, no more abuse of power," and of course, "Justice for Lily." Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding, but his resolve strong. He looked out over the crowd, at the faces of those who had come to support them, strangers who had taken on their fight as their own. With Lily standing at his side, he began to speak, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "My daughter Lily did nothing to deserve the treatment she received. She was a child, simply trying to enjoy a day at the park, like any other child," he began, pausing as a ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. "But instead of kindness and protection, she was met with hostility and violence by someone who was supposed to be her protector." Ethan's words resonated with the crowd, a mixture of parents, community leaders, and activists. This isn't just about Lily. It's about every family, every person who has ever felt helpless in the face of authority. It's about ensuring that those who hold power are held accountable for how they use it. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in a wave of support and determination. Ethan continued, "We demand change, not just for Lily, but for every child, for every family, so that no one else has to experience what she went through." He looked down at Lily, who smiled up at him, her courage shining through. In that moment, he realized that this fight, no matter how difficult, was worth every challenge. As the rally continued, other speakers took the stage, activists, civil rights lawyers, and even other parents who shared their own stories of injustice. Each voice added strength to the call for change, weaving together a tapestry of shared experiences and collective resilience. The sense of unity was palpable, a reminder that while the journey to justice was long and fraught with obstacles, it was one that they would face together. Over the following days, Ethan found himself becoming not only a father seeking justice but also an advocate for reform. He spoke at community meetings, joined discussions on local news panels, and worked alongside civil rights groups to push for transparency and accountability within law enforcement. And everywhere he went, he saw the impact of their story. People were no longer silent. They were empowered, ready to make a difference. Lily's story had become a catalyst, a spark igniting a movement that reached far beyond the walls of Greenwood Park. The once quiet community was now a beacon of hope, a reminder that when people stand together, they have the power to bring about real, lasting change. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the first witness, a middle-aged woman who had been at Greenwood Park that day with her children, took the stand. She looked visibly shaken as she recounted the incident, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the edge of the witness stand. Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind her words was unmistakable. "I was there, watching my children play, when I heard shouting," she began, her gaze directed at the jury. "I turned and saw Officer Sullivan standing over that little girl, his face full of anger." The jury listened intently, their expressions shifting as the witness continued, detailing the moment Sullivan raised his hand and struck Lily. Her voice broke slightly as she described the slap, the sound so loud that it echoed through the park, shocking everyone within earshot. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," she said, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and sadness. "This was a police officer, someone we trust to protect us. And yet he was there, striking a child. A disabled child." The impact of her words was felt throughout the room. Members of the jury exchanged uneasy glances, and a murmur rippled through the audience. There was something undeniable about her account, a vividness that brought the horror of that moment to life. She continued, recounting how parents had instinctively pulled their children close, shielding them from the violence, unable to believe that such an act could occur in broad daylight, in a place meant for family joy and innocence. Next, a father who had also been at the park stepped up, his face a mask of controlled anger. He described watching Sullivan block Lily's path, the look of defiance on her young face, and the officer's growing hostility. "I thought I was watching a bully, not a policeman," he said, his voice filled with quiet rage. "I saw him stop her, push her back, and then—" He paused, swallowing hard as he struggled to control his emotions. "And then, he just hit her. Right across the face. I could see her shock, her pain. It's an image I'll never forget." The father's testimony painted a painful picture, his words simple yet powerful. His description of the scene made it clear that this was not just an overreaction. It was an act of brutality that had left a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. "My own children asked me, 'Daddy, why did the policeman hurt that girl?'" he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "How do you explain that to a child? How do you make sense of something so wrong?" The courtroom was silent, each word sinking deep, evoking the collective shock, anger, and disbelief that had filled Greenwood Park on that day. As the witnesses stepped down, their faces solemn, it was clear that their testimonies had left a powerful impression. The jury, visibly affected, looked down, some with clenched jaws, others with eyes filled with a growing sense of outrage. One final witness, a young mother, recounted watching the incident from a distance, initially thinking it was a simple misunderstanding. But as she got closer, she realized the severity of what was happening. "I started recording as soon as I saw his hand raise," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I couldn't believe it, and I wanted proof that this wasn't some story people would brush off. I wanted the world to see what he did to her." Her words added weight to the growing mountain of evidence, a vivid reminder that the assault had been seen by many and documented in a way that left no room for denial. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the impact of the witnesses' accounts clear on the faces of those present. As she stepped down, the prosecutor, Monica Perez, nodded in acknowledgement, her expression grave but determined. With each witness, the truth of that day grew clearer, the undeniable cruelty of Sullivan's actions shining through in the words of those who had seen it firsthand. There was no hiding from it now. The stage was set for justice, and the voices of those who had witnessed the injustice demanded it. With the testimonies fresh in everyone's minds, Prosecutor Monica Perez approached the front of the courtroom, her gaze unwavering as she introduced the next piece of evidence. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice steady. "We now present the video footage recorded by witnesses at Greenwood Park on the day of the incident." She nodded toward the screen positioned at the front, where every eye in the room was now focused. The room fell silent as the video began to play. The shaky but unmistakable footage captured the scene in brutal clarity. Officer Mark Sullivan towering over Lily in her wheelchair, his face contorted with rage, his stance aggressive. As the video continued, the sound of his voice, sharp and hostile, filled the courtroom. "Get out of here! You don't belong here!" he barked, his words dripping with venom. Gasps filled the room as the camera captured Lily's small, trembling frame and the fear on her face. Then, the moment everyone dreaded but couldn't turn away from, Sullivan's hand shot out, striking Lily across the face. The slap echoed in the recording, as raw and jarring as it had been in the park that day. The camera captured Lily's reaction, her wide, shocked eyes, her small hand reaching up to her cheek, and the collective horror that swept through the crowd in the park. The footage ended with the sounds of bystanders shouting, their voices filled with disbelief and anger, the camera shaking as people moved closer to intervene. Prosecutor Perez paused the video, allowing the weight of what they just witnessed to settle in. She glanced at the jury, who sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, some with clenched jaws, others with visible distress. "Ladies and gentlemen," Perez continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "what you have just seen is undeniable proof of the abuse of power that occurred that day. A child, a vulnerable, innocent child, was assaulted by someone meant to protect her." She then presented additional footage, recorded from different angles, capturing the reactions of the crowd, the shocked parents pulling their children away, the horrified expressions of witnesses. Each video was a piece of a larger puzzle, painting a vivid, irrefutable picture of the abuse that had taken place in broad daylight. As the last video ended, the silence in the courtroom was profound, heavy with the impact of the evidence. Perez took a deep breath, her gaze returning to the jury. "This is not just about one slap or one moment of anger. It is about the betrayal of trust, about a child left traumatized by the very person who should have protected her." The jury looked back at her, visibly moved, and it was clear that the evidence had struck a deep chord. With these videos, the reality of what Lily endured was laid bare, undeniable and unforgettable. The evidence had spoken, louder than any words could, and the call for justice was now clearer than ever. Ethan Harper took a deep breath as he made his way to the witness stand. His expression was composed, yet the depth of his anguish was clear in his eyes. He adjusted the microphone, glancing briefly at Lily, who sat in the audience, her cheek still bearing a faint mark from that day. Gathering himself, he looked directly at the jury, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'm here as a father who saw his little girl suffer something no child should ever endure," he began, his words carrying a weight that filled the room. He paused, taking a deep breath, as the memories of that day flooded back. Lily was just trying to enjoy a day at the park," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "For her, every outing is special. She faces challenges every single day that most of us can't even imagine. And yet, she's one of the strongest people I know. She's taught me more about courage than anyone else." Ethan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and the courtroom was silent, every person captivated by his raw honesty. Looking directly at Sullivan, who sat across the room, Ethan's gaze hardened. "That day, I watched as someone I believed would protect my daughter instead chose to humiliate and harm her. And not because she did anything wrong, but simply because he could. Because she was vulnerable, and he saw her as an easy target." His voice was steady, but the anger beneath his calm exterior was undeniable. Ethan then turned his gaze back to the jury, his eyes filled with a father's pain and a fierce determination. "You can't imagine what it's like to hear the sound of your child crying out in pain and know that it was caused by someone who wears a badge. Someone who took an oath to protect her." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, and a hush fell over the courtroom, each person holding their breath, hanging on to his every word. "Lily still wakes up at night, reliving that moment. She still flinches when she hears loud voices, and she has lost a part of the innocence that I worked so hard to protect." His voice softened, a hint of grief breaking through. "As a father, I can't undo what happened to her. I can't erase that memory from her mind. But I can stand here, and I can demand accountability. Not just for Lily, but for every child who deserves to feel safe and respected." As he finished, Ethan's eyes lingered on the jury, his voice a powerful plea. "Today, I'm not here as an FBI agent. I'm here as a father, asking you to make sure that no child, no family, has to endure what we have. To make sure that those who abuse their power are held accountable." The courtroom remained silent as he stepped down, his presence leaving a profound impact on everyone in the room. His words had not just been a testimony, they were a call to action, an appeal to the very heart of justice. Mark Sullivan shifted uneasily in his seat as Ethan stepped down, visibly rattled by the father's powerful testimony. For the first time, the facade of confidence he'd clung to seemed to crack, revealing a hint of nervousness in his eyes. His hands fidgeted, and he glanced toward his attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer who immediately rose to his feet, ready to attempt damage control. The lawyer, straightening his suit, approached the jury, adopting a calm, measured tone as he began his statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that this is an emotional case, and it's hard not to feel sympathy for Mr. Harper and his daughter." He started, glancing at Ethan and Lily with a carefully constructed look of understanding. "But we must remember that we are here to examine facts and circumstances, not emotions." He turned his attention to the jury, his voice smooth but firm. "My client, Officer Sullivan, was acting in a crowded public space, faced with the responsibility of ensuring order. In high-stress situations, split-second decisions are often required, and sometimes mistakes are made." He paused, letting his words hang in the air as if to soften the blow of what had occurred. Mark shifted in his seat, attempting to regain his composure, and gave a slight nod in agreement with his lawyer's statement. But his demeanor was stiff, lacking the remorse or sincerity that might have helped his case. It was clear that he was relying entirely on his lawyer to sway the jury, avoiding eye contact with both Lily and the audience. The lawyer pressed on, attempting to paint Sullivan's actions as a momentary lapse rather than an intentional act of harm. Officer Sullivan believed he was handling a situation of public disturbance. He did not mean to cause harm, but rather to protect the public. He deeply regrets that his actions have been misinterpreted and that they resulted in distress to the Harper family. His voice was calm, persuasive, almost pleading as he attempted to cast Sullivan's actions in a more favorable light. But the tension in the courtroom was palpable, and many of the jury members exchanged glances, their expressions unconvinced. The defense's argument seemed hollow, a feeble attempt to rationalize an act of aggression against a defenseless child. It was hard to ignore the video footage, the testimonies, and the undeniable reality of Sullivan's actions, which painted a picture far removed from a simple, split-second mistake. Sullivan's lawyer, sensing the jury's skepticism, quickly shifted his approach. At the very least, I ask you to consider that Officer Sullivan is a man dedicated to public service. He has spent years protecting this community, and we must take into account his service, his dedication, and his record. People make mistakes, yes, but they should not be defined by a single error in judgment. The lawyer's plea hung in the air, but it was clear that his words lacked the weight needed to counterbalance the evidence presented. The justifications he offered seemed insufficient against the powerful reality of what had occurred that day in Greenwood Park. The jury's faces were stoic, unimpressed, and the atmosphere in the courtroom remained charged with the collective disbelief that Sullivan's defense could be so dismissive of the trauma he had caused. As the lawyer returned to his seat, the prosecutor prepared for her final statement, her expression resolute. The defense's attempt to diminish the incident had only served to further reveal the gravity of Sullivan's actions, reinforcing the very call for justice that had brought everyone to this moment. Prosecutor Monica Perez rose from her seat, her gaze steely as she stepped forward, eyes sweeping over the jury, then pausing on Mark Sullivan. She took a deep breath, her voice clear and unwavering as she began. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen the footage, heard the witnesses, and listened to the pleas from a father who should never have had to endure this. The defense asks you to view this as a momentary lapse, a simple mistake. But let me ask you, does a mistake leave a child with trauma and a community shaken? Her words echoed through the courtroom, each syllable deliberate and powerful. She glanced back at Lily, her expression softening for a moment. Lily Harper is a child. She deserves the same safety and respect as any other member of this community. But Officer Sullivan robbed her of that innocence, that trust in those sworn to protect her. Turning back to the jury, her voice became resolute. Today, we ask you to hold him accountable, not just for Lily, but for the very principles of justice that bind us. This isn't just about punishment, it's about setting a standard. Let your verdict reflect the truth of what happened here and the justice this family deserves. With her final words, Monica Perez stepped back, leaving a profound silence in her wake. The courtroom held its breath, awaiting the verdict that would define justice for Lily. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air as everyone waited for the jury to deliver its verdict. Every eye was on the jury foreman as he rose, clearing his throat before speaking. He looked directly at the judge, then back at the room, his face solemn and focused. In that suspended moment, it felt as if the fate of more than just one man rested on his words. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Sullivan. He paused, the air growing heavier with anticipation. Guilty on all charges. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom, releasing the tension that had built up over days of testimony and evidence. Audible gasps filled the room, followed by a ripple of relieved murmurs. Tears streamed down the faces of several onlookers, parents who had felt the fear of seeing their own children vulnerable. The room was charged with a sense of justice finally served, a collective release of breath that seemed to acknowledge that Lily's suffering had not been in vain. Sullivan's face fell, his composure breaking as the reality of the verdict set in. The arrogant defiance he had carried throughout the trial was now replaced by a look of shock, perhaps even fear. The officer's shoulders slumped, and he seemed smaller, less imposing than the man who had once towered over a little girl in a park. In contrast, the Harpers held their heads high. This was not a moment of victory for them, but one of resolution, a final affirmation that what had been done to Lily would not be swept under the rug. As the judge dismissed the jury and called for order, the energy in the room remained electric, each person feeling the weight of justice in the air. As the verdict sank in, Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a deep, lingering sorrow for all that Lily had endured. He turned to his daughter, who sat beside him, her small hands folded in her lap. Lily looked up at her father, her face reflecting a quiet strength that went far beyond her years. Her wide eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but there was something else there, too, a glimmer of hope and perhaps even pride. Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We did it, Lily, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmur in the courtroom. Justice was served. Lily managed a small smile, her lips trembling as she nodded. Does this mean he can't hurt anyone else? She asked softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that cut through Ethan's heart. Yes, Ethan replied, his voice breaking slightly. No one else. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as she leaned into him, her small frame still bearing the scars of what had happened, but her spirit unbroken. This was a moment neither of them would forget, a hard-won acknowledgement of her pain and resilience. As they embraced, members of the courtroom looked on, touched by the sight of father and daughter. It was a testament to the strength of family, of a bond unbreakable even in the face of unimaginable hurt. In that moment, for Lily and Ethan, the long journey was finally beginning to find its peace. In the days following the trial, the impact of Lily's story rippled through the community, inspiring people from all walks of life to unite for change. The footage, the testimony, and the sight of Lily's small, resilient figure standing up to injustice had struck a chord across the country. Greenwood's local leaders, alongside community members, held meetings to discuss ways to prevent such abuse of power from happening again. It was as if Lily's bravery had given them the strength to confront long-standing issues that had gone unaddressed. Protests turned into organized events, and discussions became concrete actions. New policies were proposed to ensure accountability for those in positions of authority, and police reform initiatives were brought to the forefront, demanding greater oversight, transparency, and mandatory training in bias and de-escalation. Parents, educators, activists, and city officials joined hands, each determined to make sure that no child would have to endure what Lily had. At town halls and community rallies, people carried signs that read, "Justice for Lily, justice for all," a slogan that had quickly become symbolic of their cause. Lily's story was no longer just about one child's fight, it had become a movement, a catalyst for a community determined to create a safer, fairer world for the next generation. Through it all, Ethan and Lily attended these gatherings, humbled by the support and hopeful for the future. They saw firsthand the powerful unity that arose when a community came together to right a wrong. And perhaps, for the first time since that day in the park, they felt a glimmer of hope that real change was on the horizon. As the weeks turned into months, life for Ethan and Lily began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars left by the incident remained, but with time and support, they started to heal. Lily, once hesitant to leave the safety of her home, began to regain her confidence. With Ethan's encouragement, she returned to the park where it all began. Her wheelchair rolled smoothly over the gravel path, a small but determined smile on her face as she approached the swings. The once dreaded playground now held a new meaning for Lily. Friends and classmates joined her, showing her that she was not alone, that her courage had inspired them. She was no longer just a little girl in the wheelchair. She was a symbol of resilience, of the power to stand up for what was right. And while there were still hard days, moments where fear and memories resurfaced, she had learned that her voice, and the voices of those who stood with her, had the power to bring about real change. Ethan watched with pride and relief as he saw Lily laugh and play again, her spirit stronger than ever. He knew the journey they'd been on had changed them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. But as he looked at his daughter, her eyes bright with newfound hope, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, for her strength, for the support of their community, and for the opportunity to rebuild a future grounded in resilience and justice. Together, they faced forward, knowing that while the road to healing was ongoing, each day brought with it a little more light, a little more hope, and a little more peace. As their lives continued forward, Lily and Ethan's story left an indelible mark on everyone who had followed it. Their journey was a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from standing up against injustice, of the impact a single voice can have when it refuses to be silenced. Lily's courage and Ethan's relentless pursuit of justice became symbols of hope and resilience, a beacon for countless others who felt unseen or unheard. Their story teaches us that no matter how small or vulnerable someone may seem, every person deserves dignity, respect, and protection. And when we stand together, we can transform pain into progress, injustice into accountability, and trauma into healing. If you've been moved by this story, consider joining us on this journey by subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of strength and courage, reminding us all of the power within every voice. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice is something we create together, one story at a time.